It's the inexplicable phenomena and cryptic disappearances that brew up storms in the minds of many. Among the most affected, though, are the leading experts who begin to question their very reality and career choices. Number 10. Among the various megalithic monuments littered all over the world that are left shrouded in mystery, we find Ishi no Hoden, the floating rock of Japan. It's just one of thousands of stones that defy all logical explanation. Situated on the grounds of the Oshika Jinja in Takasago, Hyogo Prefecture, it is a curious sight to behold. The gigantic stone structure is among Japan's most mysterious and bewildering monuments. Shaped like an old tube TV, the 20-foot-tall and 500-ton artifact seems to hover above a pond. Although it sounds like just a simple structure, possibly created by an ancient society, experts in the history and archaeology fields have been left dumbfounded by this colossal creation. Even though it appears that Ishi no Hoden is floating above the water in some sort of magical, physics-defying way, it does have a structure in the center that allows it to stand. But it isn't the levitation that has people scratching their heads. The object instead calls for answers to the questions of who made it and why. Dubbed the floating rock, the artifact has been a site of pilgrimage for ages. Many have come to the prefecture to experience the wonder for themselves. Historians and archaeologists, though, flock to the rock for a different reason: to unravel one of 3 mysterious wonders of Japan. Despite their best efforts, though, the mystery still lingers. No one knows its age, and there's only one historical record regarding such a stone, but it's one that does not speak the truth. Looking into the historical record, historians came across the Harima no Kuni Fudoki, a document detailing local customs of the Harima province, which was compiled around the early 700s. Harima is the old name for the province that is now known as the Hyogo Prefecture. The written record speaks of a rock consistent with the appearance of the Ishi no Hoden, but there's just one problem. The document claims that it was made by Mononobe no Moriya, one of the strongmen of the 6th century. This declaration was made during the reign of Prince Shotoku, who's been considered the greatest figure in Japan's ancient political history. The problem with this account is that Shotoku only came into power years after Moriya passed away. Adding to the complexity of the mystery, it appears that this structure also has similarities and connections with the Masuda no Iwafune, the famous stone ship in Asuka. Located in the neighboring province of Nara are various other structures that also share the same style of sculpture, which dates back to about 14,000 BC to 200 BC, the oldest known Japanese prehistoric civilization. Some historians and archaeologists believe that the mystery structure could be from the same period, but dating technology has failed to confirm the idea. Various theories abound about the purpose of the megalith, with over 40 ideas being in circulation. One proposition linked the structure to a battle between 2 clans, the Soga, who supported Buddhism, and the Mononobe, who supported Shintoism. Modern novelist Seicho Matsumoto, though, has an alternate theory. He advocated for the idea that this construct was meant to be a Zoroastrian altar. But from an archaeological perspective, many experts believe that this may have been a coffin of sorts, which is often the prevailing theory when it comes to odd stone structures that take on curious shapes. One expert, Hiroshi Nakamura, of the Hyogo Prefectural Museum of Archaeology, believes that this megalith was constructed around 50 years prior to the Harima record. It was created from tuff, and the area around Ishi no Hoden is a stone quarry used to provide the materials for coffins 1,700 years ago. Nakamura suggested that the ancient civilization tried to carry it out of the quarry, but may have abandoned it for physical reasons. But a radar survey seemed to discount the expert's idea. The study was conducted in 2008 and confirmed there were no holes or cavities present within the walls of the structure. Such cavities would have been necessary for housing a body. With more studies being conducted into the mysterious artifact, some archaeologists pointed out something about the shape of the creation. The side of the stone facing the shrine is considered to be the front, and on the opposite side, there is a roof-shaped protrusion. This makes the carving look like a tipped-over house, and with this visual in mind, arguments have been sparked over another theory. Is the structure meant to be standing upright? Some believe that the megalith was intended to be hoisted up into an upright position, but some wonder if that would even be possible. Various historians have become part of the Ishino-Hoden research team, as attempted efforts continue in the quest for answers. Number 9. In 1948, a British airliner called the Star Tiger enigmatically disappeared. It made no distress calls and left no trace. Perhaps there was an issue with the design of the Avro Tudor because just a year later, another Tudor would disappear after possibly suffering from some sort of failure. It was the Star Ariel. The Avro Tudor airliner, created by the chief designer Roy Chadwick, was not the ideal passenger craft given its high fuel consumption, the tendency to swing on takeoff, and the fact that they would regularly and abruptly stall. After the company saw criticism from the British Overseas Aircraft Corporation, they began to redesign and create an alternate version of the craft. This too was a failure, and saw a few fatalities, wrecks, and disappearances mid-flight. Still, the company persisted, resulting in the Tudor 4. After 3 crafts disappeared, an inquiry was made into the company and the aircraft, but passenger operations would resume in the summer of 1948. The first of the Tudor 4 airliners would meet the BSAA that year, and then a slight variation called the Tudor IVB came next. The British South American Airways Star Ariel was one of the newer Tudor IVBs and was on the ground on the 17th of January in 1949 in Kindley Field, Bermuda, where it would await instructions. Those instructions would signal its flight back to Britain after having just completed a flight to Kingston. But as it awaited signal, the Star Lion was approaching Bermuda when it suffered engine failure. While it was able to land safely, it would need repairs in order to complete the trip, and so the Star Ariel was pressed in as a replacement. At 8:41 that morning, the Star Ariel departed Bermuda and headed back to Kingston, carrying 11 hours worth of fuel, 7 crew members, and 13 passengers, all of whom had been on the doomed Star Lion. The weather conditions that morning were excellent for flying. There was little wind and no cloud above 10,000 feet. Taking advantage of the optimal conditions, Captain McPhee brought the plane to a height of 18,000 feet. Not long after departure, Star Ariel would send out a routine update to Bermuda. The update stated that the plane had departed and was estimated to arrive at 2:10 that afternoon. The captain also claimed there was good visibility. Less than 10 minutes later, the radio station would receive another message. It was the captain explaining that he would be changing the frequency to MRX and giving their current position, but this message seemed unusual. The aircraft wouldn't be able to switch to that station until they were at least halfway to Bermuda. But after receiving that update, the station received no further messages, assuming that the aircraft had made contact with MRX. But that 9:42 message would be the last time anyone heard from the Star Ariel. Given the confusion regarding what station the plane was in contact with, there was considerable delay in realizing that something was amiss. MRX was monitoring the frequencies, but there had been a strange communication error that day. Throughout the morning on the 17th of January, there had been significant static interference and a radio blackout that lasted several minutes. This enigmatic interference has never been explained and was said to have lasted until that afternoon. The radio issues affected the airport in Kingston, where the Star Ariel was destined to land. Other stations from New York, Nassau, Miami, and Havana were also monitoring the frequency, but reported receiving no messages from the craft. It wasn't until much later, after the plane was due to Kingston, that the first attempts to contact it were made, but these efforts proved futile. The Star Ariel had vanished, and its route would take it right through the Bermuda Triangle. The BSAA's Star Panther was sent to look for the missing craft. It took off from Nassau and intersected the planned route before flying back to Bermuda in search of wreckage, but nothing was ever seen. Experts in various fields of aviation, the Army, and radio stations were left confused. The report repeated the same sentence that was used in the Star Tiger disappearance just 12 months earlier. Through lack of evidence due to no wreckage having been found, the cause of this accident is unknown. Number 8. From the 12th of April, 1945 to the 20th of January, 1953, the 33rd President of the United States served the country. He succeeded Franklin D. Roosevelt and signed a proclamation authorizing the U.S. to enter the Korean War. President Harry Truman abolished the discrimination of national origin, race, and religion in the U.S. Armed Forces through Executive Order 9981. It was such a time in which the presidents were permitted to keep certain gifts for themselves, with the approval of Congress, of course, until new changes abolished such a thing in 1966. When Truman went into office, he was bothered by the random gifts and pages that were left sprawled across the White House and Oval Office. It was beginning to look like a luxury flea market, so he made alternative arrangements for the space-occupying pieces. And so, while in office, he made arrangements for the establishment of the Presidential Library, where the gifts and papers would be fed back into the federal government. During his presidency, Truman was also given gifts, specifically from the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian King, and the Shah of Iran. The Crown Prince, Amir Saud, would have a 15-minute-long meeting with Truman while the relationship was still fresh. To pay his respects to the president, Amir Saud presented him with bejeweled swords with scabbards and a dagger. These weapons were said to be crafted from gold and steel and inlaid with rubies and diamonds. It was quite the gift that would ultimately end up in the Harry S. Truman Presidential Library and Museum, where it would be kept safe, or so we all thought. Truman's time as president had come and gone, with President Jimmy Carter now taking up residency in the Oval Office. It was the 4th of March, 1978, the early stages of the Iranian Revolution. In Independence, Missouri, a brazen theft was afoot. It was 6:30 a.m. when thieves entered the presidential library, sneaking around to see what they could take. It didn't take long before their eyes landed on the priceless dagger and the bejeweled swords. From start to finish, it took only 45 seconds to complete the theft. They smashed and grabbed while a security guard stood on the other side of the building, distracted. The weapons were gone, and immediate efforts were made to find them. Local law enforcement weren't the only ones on the case. The FBI was called in too. They had many means of tracking down the thieves at their very disposal, yet they couldn't figure it out. No credible leads have since surfaced for the artifacts that are valued at an estimated $1 million. Theories in this case are minimal, much like the evidence itself. As of 2025, the FBI is still searching, stating that a $10,000 reward is on the table for anyone who leads to the recovery of Truman's gifts. Number 7. Cape Hatteras borders the Hatteras Islands of North Carolina. Located in the Outer Banks area, is this place that finds itself host to multiple maritime mysteries and legends. Enigmas like Theodosia Burr, Robert H. Stevenson, and numerous shipwrecks led to it becoming named the Graveyard of the Atlantic. This nickname stays true in the case of Carol A. Deering, the ghost ship of the Outer Banks. The 5-masted commercial schooner was built in 1919 in Maine and ran until its untimely demise in 1921, leaving behind the makings of a ghost story. It was the 29th of January when the Deering departed the shores of Barbados en route to a return trip to Hampton Roads, Virginia. The ship seemed to be sailing smoothly until it came across the Cape Lookout lightship. A lightship keeper claimed that the crew on board the vessel were milling around. The keeper pointed out that the crewman does not look or act like an officer. Nevertheless, the ship made its way through the waters, and the next day it would pass the SS Lake Elon near the Diamond Shoals lightship. It was late afternoon, and the Deering seemed to be heading on a particular course. The sighting by the SS Lake Elon would be the last report received regarding the whereabouts of the ill-fated vessel, which would be found run aground. On the 31st of January, around 6:30 that morning, the schooner was seen by an officer at the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard station, and he claimed that the ship was aground and helpless. Its deck was awash, the sails were set, the lifeboats were missing, and no one was aboard. Rough waters would prevent boats from reaching the wreckage until the rescue wrecker managed to reach the battered ship many days later. It was only then that the vessel was confirmed to be the missing Carol A. Deering. While investigating the ship, various features would become prevalent. There were no personal belongings left aboard. key navigational equipment was gone, and there were no anchors. The strangest aspect of all, though, was that a prepared meal for the crew was laid out, awaiting to be eaten. In 1921, the Deering was towed away and disposed of, but this would not be the end of the mystery. A month later, a Buxton resident reportedly discovered a message in a bottle, one that spoke of the Deering and its capture by pirates. When experts were called in, they discovered that the letter was a hoax and written by the discoverer himself. Another month passed, and the wife of Captain Merritt, who was aboard the Deering, called for more investigation, so the FBI would become involved. Agent Thompson was one among many agents on the case who followed up on leads regarding pirates, gangsters, and mutiny. But when he spoke to the Coast Guard and mentioned one theory suggesting that the crew mutinied and ditched the ship before it met the shoals, he was met with a one-word answer: impossible. The coast was too rough for the lifeboats to land in. With no evidence aboard, aside from a full meal, any further investigations proved fruitless. The case of Carol A. Deering was left unsolved with no crew, no ship log, and no witnesses. Number 6. It was the 7th of July, 1730, 5 p.m., when the world's most notorious pirate, Olivier Levasseur, also known as the Buzzard, stood on the gallows. He'd finally been captured and was due to pay for his crimes. Once serving as the privateer for the French crown, Levasseur earned himself the nickname Buzzard due to his swift predatory tactics. It was he who was the original pirate of the Caribbean, with a life of piracy spanning up to 15 years. Seconds before the rope would be tossed around his neck, Levasseur produced a necklace for the growing crowd. He threw it to the wind, exclaiming, "Find my treasure, he who can," but no one ever has. This is because in order to find the greatest treasure haul in history, one must first solve the 17-line cipher that was once embedded in the necklace, which has since disappeared. Even though the jewelry has been lost to time, the cryptogram remains, and many still attempt to decipher it, hoping to get their hands on the great loot. The cipher was said to consist of 17 lines of random symbols that supposedly revealed the location of billions of dollars worth of treasure. The first transcription of the coded message, though, is believed to have first been publicly mentioned in 1934, 200 years after the pirates' demise. It was spoken of in a book written by Charles de la Roncière, who claimed that it was a pigpen cipher. But even with the knowledge of how to decrypt such a code, Levasseur's cryptogram remains as enigmatic as the day it was discovered. The code consists of various angled symbols, some of which contain dots within. Standing out in the collection, though, is the number 2 and a faded large dot. According to experts, certain symbols can be interpreted as either a letter or a digit, such as the letter A, and alternatively, they can be interpreted as the number 1. The French author was able to convert the symbols into numbers and letters, but most of them remain incomprehensible. There are only a few French words that are recognizable in the test, leading some to theorize that the 17 lines are actually just a very bad copy of the original. The legend of Olivier Levasseur stands as a testament to the intrigue and mystery that has coded the era of piracy. Despite having existed many years ago, his name continues to circulate in conjunction with his unsolvable cipher and the treasure awaiting to be uncovered. Number 5. It was 1853 when Lieutenant R.S. Williamson headed for the grounds of what would later become known as Fort Tejon. It was his mid-1850s mapping mission, in conjunction with the plan for a practicable railway route that would run from the Mississippi River to the Pacific Ocean. Accompanying him was a geologist named William P. Blake, who wrote a brief description of the Oak Grove. He described the valley as being covered in grass with deep soil, supporting incredible oak trees, some of which were 8 feet in diameter. But Blake's description of the grove also held something strange. He wrote of a peculiar inscription carved into a large oak. It spoke of a man named Peter Lebec, whose life was taken by an ex-bear on the 17th of October, 1837. The geologist also noted how the area was in great stock of grizzly bears, which was deemed unusual. Not thinking much of it at the time, the smoothed inscription was left without further research, and a year later, the grove was garrisoned at Fort Tejon. It was the first military fort in the interior of California. Some years had passed, and the inscription disappeared beneath the overgrowth of bark and moss, and the mysterious carving fell into obscurity. It wasn't until a group known as the Foxtail Rangers ventured back into the grove in the 1880s and 1890s that the Lebec mystery would reemerge. The Rangers peeled back the bark to find the epitaph inscription, now in reverse on its underside. They were also able to exhume Lebec's remains and have them reburied. The bark has since been encased in the U.S. Forestry Ranger Station, and a proper headstone was placed beneath the oak in 1938. The Rangers' efforts would allow the case of Peter Lebec to resurface, bringing about some still unanswered questions. Who was Lebec? What was an X-bear? And who made the epitaph? At the time, observers and experts were left puzzled by the presence of the X on the epitaph. It was only assumed that it was referring to a grizzly bear, which was common in the area at the time because of their unique mane pattern that takes on an X shape. For some, though, this assumption was not so convincing. They pointed out that there were at least 6 different bears in the area, including cinnamon bears, red bears, and brown bears. California natives, though, only had words relating to 2 types of bears, which were the grizzly and black bears. Given the fact that the black bears are not nearly as aggressive, it can only be surmised that Lebec met his end at the claws of a grizzly. Even if experts could solve the mystery of the bear that led to the man's demise, 2 questions remain. In most accounts regarding the case, Lebec is assumed to be a French trapper, but there's no evidence to confirm this idea, and it also comes with some inconsistencies that somewhat discount the theory. Many theories that came after this have hinged on a strange discovery that was made at Fort Tejon, a discovery that would bring the accepted assumption of a French trapper into question. It was in 1915 when Sam Allen, an employer who worked at a ranch on the fort grounds, happened upon a 5-franc coin embedded in a pile of adobe bricks that were ruined by an earthquake. It was dated 1837, which lends credence to the French origin theory. But why would Lebec have such coins miles away from his homeland in California? It was this question that forced historians to discount the idea that the coin was Lebec's, and also pointed out that the epitaph was carved in English. If he was from France, then what would he have been doing all this way in California? Some thought that perhaps he was an Acadian French spy saboteur from Louisiana. Another theory connects the mystery man to the Hudson Bay Company, but there's no record confirming that he was employed there at any point. So who was Peter Lebec? Experts have been left scratching their heads regarding this question. All that's known is that he was fatally mauled and buried in a tree by an unknown English-speaking individual, whose identity remains just as enigmatic as Lebec's. Number 4. The Korean War was just over a year into its struggle. It had begun in June of 1950, when simmering tensions spiked to a full-blown attack. Canadian Pacific Airlines were readying their Douglas DC-4. The craft was a 4-engined piston airliner and was built in 1944 for the U.S. Army Air Forces as a Douglas C-54A Skymaster, only to be converted to the DC-4 standard. Canadian Pacific Airlines had flown over 700 airlifts for the U.S. Army amid the war, and this plane would be one of them. Carrying 37 people aboard, 6 of which were part of the crew, the DC-4 departed Vancouver International Airport, Canada, bound for Tokyo. It left the ground at 8:53 on the evening of the 21st of July in 1951, with its first immediate stop intended for Anchorage, Alaska. The Cape Spencer intersection in British Columbia gave an ETA for midnight the next day. The plane was on schedule and was due in Anchorage for a refueling in just 90 minutes, but then it encountered some poor weather conditions. Heavy rain and icy conditions lowered the visibility to just 500 feet. A regular routine flight had just turned daunting and unpredictable. At 12:17 a.m., the plane, with just a few hours worth of fuel remaining, would report its position at being off Cape Spencer, 80 miles west of Juneau. But hours had drifted by, and the DC-4 had still not made it to the airport in Anchorage. In fact, no one had heard from it since the 12:17 a.m. update. Aside from a weak radio signal that may or may not have come from that aircraft, there was silence. Then, in the early hours of Saturday evening, those signals would cease. The following day, there was still no sign of the plane. Officials began to suspect that it was down. It simply didn't have enough fuel to keep it running for more than 6 hours, and soon extensive efforts would commence. The United States and Canada sent 21 airplanes to the last reported location. The U.S. Coast Guard used surface vessels to scour Alaska. 5 B-17s equipped with lifeboats were deployed and searched a 300-mile area from Cape Spencer to Middleton Island. Another group of aircraft had flown over a 150-mile area near Yakutat and 40 miles inland, while another scoured the coastal regions, hoping to spot the downed aircraft. The beaches were routinely patrolled by Coast Guard cutters, waiting for any sign of debris. For the next 3 months, these efforts would continue, but all efforts would fail to find any trace of the Douglas DC-4 or its occupants. On the 31st of October, 1951, it was final. The search was called off. To this day, the ill-fated flight remains missing, and some theories regarding its fate have emerged. Everett Swarms, the brother of a passenger who was aboard the missing craft, believes that it either went off course or ultimately ran out of fuel and sank, or it was flying near the mountains on the opposite side of the bay, which reach heights of 14,000 feet. The plane was last recorded reaching a height of 9,000 feet, making it plausible that it may have crashed into the mountains and become buried in the snow. Number 3. Death Valley, California has an average of 4 fatalities a year. Its winding roads and rough terrain have led to vehicle rollovers and hiking accidents. It's also home to many disappearances and much mystery. It sees the deployment of many search parties and regular patrols, making it one of the more dangerous tourist destinations. It would also be the scene of another alluring disappearing act involving a lieutenant and some strange details that have left many concerned. On the 17th of August in 1958, a game warden was making regular patrols when he happened upon an abandoned vehicle with keys still in the ignition and no signs of foul play. It was found in the desert, some 40 miles away from the nearest town. Through further investigation, the park discovered that it was registered to Lieutenant Paul Byron Whipkey, a Fort Ord, California resident, which was located around 500 miles away. Alarmed by the discovery, they alerted the authorities. It just so happened that the Army had reported Whipkey missing after he vanished just 5 weeks prior. In fact, he was wanted as a deserter, an aspect that has sparked much controversy. According to his family and friends, he was the perfect soldier, and no one believed that he could possibly be wanted as a deserter. Whipkey's mystery would begin on the 10th of July that year, when he left Fort Ord in the late afternoon, telling friends that he'd be heading to Monterey, a town located just a mile away. But he never returned from his mystery trip, and the very next day, he was reported AWOL. With still no sign of the lieutenant, 30 days later, the Army was forced to declare him as a deserter. During their initial investigation, they discovered that on the day he left his home, he ended up at White Motel, located in Mojave. He allegedly signed the guest registry there. The investigators also discovered a gasoline receipt from the abandoned vehicle, revealing that he'd purchased gas 145 miles away from Death Valley. It was out of character and mysterious. Whipkey was simply gone. But as mentioned, there exist some odd aspects to this case that prompt many questions. On the very morning that Whipkey was reported missing, 2 soldiers had stripped his bedroom. They removed absolutely everything, including all of Whipkey's personal items. Not only was this an incredibly odd thing to do, but it was also illegal. According to regulations, the next of kin, or a legal representative, should be notified prior to the belongings being packed up. None of Whipkey's family had been notified, which made it a rather suspicious act. The case only gets stranger from there. Just a few weeks later, a witness alleged to have seen Whipkey's car in Death Valley, but it was being driven by a man in military attire. But the missing lieutenant had departed his home in civilian clothing, so it couldn't have been him. Upon the discovery of the vehicle, the pile of cigarette butts was also discovered nearby, but the missing man wasn't a smoker. Whipkey's family was particularly troubled by the fact that the Army had waited exactly 9 months before searching for him or his body. But family weren't the only ones deeply troubled by the way the disappearance was being handled. Whipkey's commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lewis, also thought that something was amiss. It was peculiar that he was being viewed and classified as a deserter with these strange aspects in mind. Lewis decided to start investigating. He also recalled that the previous military officials arrived at the station in plain clothes, asking for Whipkey. After this, Lewis would often see the three of them talking, which would regularly leave behind a feeling of rigidity and nervousness in the missing lieutenant's mannerisms. Adding another layer of complexity to the case is that just 12 days after he disappeared, a close friend, Lieutenant Charles Guess, who would also serve at the same station, disappeared too. He had taken off from Bishop, California by plane and vanished. In 1959, though, wreckage was found, and so were the remains of Guess. Strangely, though, the serial number of the craft didn't match the one that he had initially taken off on. The brother of Whipkey continued to lobby for answers and investigations to take place, which led to a review of the case in 1982. The review would lead to a renaming of Whipkey's status, ridding him of the deserter title, but no further inquests into his vanishing were made, and to this day, he remains enigmatically missing. Number 2. Among the most mysterious of all missing aircraft stories, the disappearance of the Northwest Orient Airlines Flight 2501 is the most confusing. The craft was a former C-54, converted to the standard Douglas DC-4 that operated for Northwest Orient Airlines. The craft was making its daily routine transcontinental trip between New York and Seattle on the 23rd of June, 1950. With 55 passengers on board and 3 crew members, the plane was being steered toward Lake Michigan. Midnight was approaching with violent squalls waiting to meet the plane ahead. A storm was brewing over the lake, one that was about to cause some severe turbulence and intense lightning flashes. These conditions forced the pilots of 3 westbound trips to turn back. While Flight 2501 was near Benton Harbor in Michigan, it radioed to the control room to request permission to fly lower by 1,000 feet. It gave no reason for this, but air traffic control decided to deny the request because other craft were in the area. The pilot acknowledged the denial, and that would be the last time that anyone would hear from him, and from Flight 2501. The plane was due to make stopovers in Minneapolis and Spokane, but just moments later, a sputtering noise and terrifying flash marked the end of the trip. Flight 2501 was now downed and missing. It had been hovering just above Lake Michigan when it sent out its last transmission, leading officials to believe that it must have met the water. The United States Coast Guard headed to the lake and found oil slicks near Milwaukee. The search for the craft and its passengers was focused here initially, but 2 days later, some 10 miles offshore of South Haven, items that seemed to have come from that plane began to turn up. Responders thought that they'd been looking in the wrong area and began scouring various parts of the lake. Limited visibility, though, would hinder the efforts to locate the plane. As search efforts were underway, further inquiries were being made into why the plane had plummeted in the first place. The United States Civil Aeronautics Board said that the cause of the most fatal commercial airliner incident in history was unknown. For years to come, experts and enthusiasts would find themselves on boats drifting across Lake Michigan, sonar equipment in tow. More than 300 square miles of the lake's bottom have been dragged in search of Flight 2501. 14 shipwrecks have been located and identified here, as well as a few planes, but none of them are Flight 2501. Number 1. The Red Baron is the name given to the World War I fighter pilot Manfred von Richthofen. In his 20 months of combat, he would mow down 80 enemy planes, 21 of which occurred in April of 1917 alone. Manfred would greatly be rewarded for such achievements. He received 24 military decorations, which is far more than any German aviator had received in the Great War. Allied pilots had much reason to fear the sudden appearance of this bright red fighter plane. With the sun at his back, Manfred would swoop in and hurl straight towards his opposition, leaving many wondering what was going through his head. But as with all good things, the reign of the Red Baron had to come to an end at some point. And that point came on the 21st of April, 1918. After plummeting from the air, Manfred's remains were recovered by Allied troops in France. He was given a burial with full military honors. Even though the Allies were honoring a fallen enemy, they were also trying to figure out who was behind the fatal blow. Some of the soldiers began to claim credit for his demise, boasting themselves as the pilot who took down the Red Baron. But with so many claiming credit, the mystery would remain. Who ended the Red Baron? A squadron from the Australian Flying Corps initially claimed credit, stating that they had engaged with the red plane believed to belong to Manfred. After looking into this allegation, though, critics believed that the same squadron was actually engaged with other aircraft from the same unit. Another theory is that the forces that collided with the Baron didn't come from the air at all, but rather from the ground. Even this theory has more ideas and stories attached to it. Some say it was an Australian anti-aircraft battery. Accounts collected in the 30s from 3 witnesses tell the story of the Baron's end. According to them, he was in pursuit of 2 Sopwith camels when he was brought down by alleged ground fire. Sergeant A.G. Franklin, who was in charge of the anti-aircraft battery, claimed credit for the final blow. Experts believe that this account may be confused with the demise of a German airplane that took place the following day nearby. Another proposal was that a lone rifleman of unknown identity downed him. It's even been suggested that a ground-based machine weapons crew was responsible for the fatal takedown, but none of these theories would stand. The Royal Air Force would ultimately give credit to No. 209 Squadron's captain, Roy Brown. His combat report, though, only gives the barest outline. It claimed that he had dived on a pure red triplane that had been firing on another lieutenant. Brown alleged that he got a long burst into him and he went down vertically, crashing nearby. Recent inquiries into the attack have found that Brown's encounter with the Baron came at least 1 minute before the final crash, though, which was too early for it to be him that inflicted the final blow. The theories range from immortal in air combat training, a takedown from the ground, a 2-seater demise, and an anonymous rifleman. With so many conflicting accounts and supposed eyewitness testimony, the question of who took down the Red Baron persists, sparking controversy and leaving experts of various fields baffled by the sudden demise. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.